People have always been the foolish victims of deception and self-deception in politics, and they always will be until they have learned to seek out the interests of some class or other behind all moral, religious, political, and social phrases, declarations, and promises. Now that was said by Vladimir Lenin, the leader of the Russian Revolution, and it's in a famous essay that he wrote called Three Components of Marxism. A very important essay that Lenin wrote explaining Marxist teaching, Marxist ideology in pretty basic terms. I'll read it one more time. He said, "People have always been the foolish victims of deception and self-deception in politics, and they always will be until they have learned to seek out the interests of some class or other behind all moral, religious, political, and social phrases, declarations, and promises." What does that mean? Well, it means that until you have a class view of things, until you start seeing things in terms of class politics, you're never really going to be able to understand things. You're always going to be in a state of deception or self-deception. I want to talk to you specifically about the issue of democracy and human rights, because this is an area in which there's a lot of deception and self-deception. But the thing is that a lot of people get blocked in this area. They just can't go there. Let me describe what blocked means, right? So, for example, right, if someone is very, 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 very religious, very, very religious, and you start to argue with them about metaphysics, about the existence of God, etc., they're just going to have a block. In a lot of cases, they'll just say, you know what, I cannot pursue this argument with you. They'll just stop. And the reason for that is you're not really arguing with them about ideas. You are threatening their entire worldview. They cannot argue with you about the existence of God because their entire worldview, the entire way they see themselves, is in jeopardy. So they just can't have that conversation with you. Right? And that happens around religion, that happens around politics, and this area that I'm talking about with you today, the issue of human rights, the issue of democracy, the issue of freedom, a lot of people get blocked there because the whole way that we come to think about politics in the United States and in the West in general is centered around these concepts and a certain way of understanding these concepts. And if you start to take that apart, it is so disorienting for some people. So if you're one of the people that has a block around the issue of human rights or the issue of democracy or the issue of freedom, if you just have a block around that issue, you're not going to get a lot of what I have to say. But if you don't have a block, if you will listen to what I have to say here, you will start to understand the world with a huge amount of depth that you never had before. I'm going to push the envelope today, and I'm going to force you to question some basic things that you've been taught all your life. And by doing that, I'll be getting you to go beyond bourgeois idealism and to grasp historical and dialectical materialism. Folks, the way we are taught in the United States to think about the concept of freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, democracy, freedom of religion, elected governments, the way we are taught to think about these things is like this. There are some countries that are good, and those are countries that have democracy, that elect the government, that have freedom of speech and freedom of religion and freedom of assembly, freedom of the press. And there are some countries that are bad, and they do not have freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of the press. They don't have real elections to elect their leaders, and those countries are bad. And the mission of the West is to spread democracy and freedom around the world, and enemies of the West, be they communists, or fascists or whatnot. These are people who do not believe in freedom of assembly, freedom of the press, democracy, elected government, and the West battles against those people and spreads freedom throughout the world. Now, that's the way we're generally taught to think about the issue of freedom, human rights, democracy, etc. And on the surface, just accepting that narrative, it's already wrong, okay? And it's very easy to take apart, right? The United States backs, arms, and supports Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia does not have freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly. It has a hereditary monarchy. It cuts off people's heads in public. 1/3 of the country are guest worker slaves who have no freedom whatsoever. You can get the death penalty for insulting the king or sorcery. So clearly Saudi Arabia is not, a free democratic society, and it's backed by the United States. So that shows hypocrisy. The United States condemns Syria, alleging it's not democratic. Saudi Arabia, is a brutal autocracy. The United States condemns Iran, says that, it doesn't have enough freedom of religion. Well, Saudi Arabia has no freedom of religion whatsoever, right? So on the surface, we can see that this narrative is loaded with hypocrisy. And during the Cold War, the main thing that leftists and socialists and communists did was go around exposing the hypocrisy of this narrative. The USA was constantly saying it was for democracy, communism is against democracy. But if you looked at all the allies of the United States, people like Augusto Pinochet, people like Ferdinand Marcos in the Philippines, people like brutal dictators in Indonesia, brutal dictators in Africa and Latin America, military juntas. The USA was going around saying it believed in freedom and democracy, and the communists were bad because they didn't believe in freedom and democracy, and it was pretty easy to show that there were all kinds of people associated with the United States, armed by the United States, backed by the United States, supported by the United States, who did not believe in freedom and democracy. And there were all kinds of brutal military coups. In 1965 in Indonesia, the elected government was toppled. Suharto took power, and there was a mass slaughter of roughly 500,000 people. It turned into a genocide of ethnically Chinese people. Later, there was a genocide in East Timor backed by the United States, right? All throughout Latin America, there were brutal military dictators, brutal military juntas backed by the United States. Elected governments were toppled and replaced by the military with the support of the CIA. 1953, in Guatemala, the people of Guatemala elected Arbenz, who was kind of a social democrat. Well, the CIA overthrew him and put in a military dictatorship, right? Later in the 1980s, you had the military dictator Rios Montt, who was backed by the United States and committed mass genocide against native people, locked up all his political opponents. That was in Guatemala. You can talk about many examples throughout the Cold War of the United States backing and arming people who were not believers in democracy. And that is a very legitimate point. It shows that the leaders of the Western world are not true to their ideals, right? They claim they exist simply to spread freedom and spread democracy around the world. They claim communists are bad because communists don't believe in freedom and don't believe in democracy. Well, you can rip that to shreds by simply pointing out that the United States is not true to its own logic, right? That there are plenty of forces backed and supported by the United States that are not democratic, that are not adhering to human rights, that are violating human rights, that are brutal, that are dictatorial. But that, on the surface of it, that's a very good deconstruction of the Pentagon propaganda. It's good. That's a very good deconstruction of Pentagon propaganda, but it still doesn't get beyond the basic narrative. And often people who put that narrative out there still buy into the idea that there are just simply good countries and bad countries, and the good countries have freedom, the bad countries don't have freedom. Good countries have made a choice to have freedom, bad countries have just not made the choice to have freedom, and while they realize the United States is hypocritical around these issues, they essentially just want the United States to not be hypocritical around these issues. They want the United States to really practice what it preaches. But here's the thing, folks. Here's narrative is not correct. That narrative is not understanding the nature of human society and the nature of history. And that might be a little bit hard for people to swallow. But this narrative that we have in the West, that there are good countries and bad countries have freedom, bad countries don't have freedom, this narrative is a huge, huge, huge oversimplification. First of all, let's talk about the United States, right? The United States, let's talk about it. The United States was founded with some pretty good documents: the Constitution, Declaration of Independence, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But for the majority of U.S. history, there was slavery. Up until 1865, Civil War ends, you have slavery. Now, what was going on there? Well, they said these natural rights, these human rights, these natural rights, they just didn't apply to Africans. And I guess around the time that slavery was abolished, they discovered that these natural rights did apply to Africans. For the majority of U.S. history, women could not vote. So what do they say? Well, I guess, these natural rights existed, and we just didn't realize, just slipped our minds that they also applied to women. But I guess, around 1920, we figured out that women have these natural rights. In fact, let's look at world history. No one anywhere in the world, no society anywhere in the world recognized that people had the right to life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, right? Life, liberty, and property until like the 1400s. No one talked about it. No one discussed it. It just wasn't an issue. No one thought of it. No one talked about it. Now, these are supposed to be natural rights that we are endowed with by our Creator. But it never occurred to anybody that we should have freedom of speech or freedom of assembly or freedom of religion or the right to property or the right to peaceably assemble, or never occurred to anybody. No one thought of it until the 1400s. That's a good thing. It was a very good development when people started thinking that way. But if these things are eternal concepts, if these are things that should exist in all societies at all times, why did we just discover them in the 1400s? Human beings have been around for thousands and thousands of years. Right? Human civilization, as we know it, didn't start until roughly 6,000 or 7,000 years ago. So for the majority of human civilization, it never occurred to anyone that we should have freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, right? Freedom of religion, elected government. None of that ever occurred to anybody until like the 1400s. Why? Why? If these are universal human rights that all human beings should have in all circumstances, that all societies should have in all circumstances, if all of your understanding of global politics and global situations is there are good countries that have these rights, there are bad countries that don't have these rights, if that is the situation, why, for the overwhelming majority of human existence, did no one ever talk about this and acknowledge this? If everyone in all of human history should have exactly the same level of freedom that I have right now, and if they don't have it, this is a crime being committed, this is a human rights violation, then why did no one even think about giving people these rights until like the 1400s? Why, for the beginning of U.S. history, did we not apply them to, the enslaved population? Why did we not apply these rights to women? What is going on here? Folks, human rights are good. I'm very happy that I have freedom of speech. I'm very happy that I have freedom of assembly. I'm very happy that I have freedom of religion. I'm very happy that I get to vote for my elected leaders. I'm very happy about all of those things. I would fight to defend those things. But why do I have them? Do I have them because all societies throughout human history have been evil? But then somebody in the 1400s said, we really ought to have some rights. And based on that, everything... I mean, is that what happened? No. Folks, nothing is eternal in the universe. Can you see that? It says A does not equal A. A does not equal A. There is no way that this first A can be like this second A. There will always be some difference. Nothing in the universe is the same, and everything in the universe is constantly in a state of change. And one of the things that every ruling class in history has done is they have tried to present their society, their order, their political form, their economic form, their ideology, as if it is eternal. But the reality is that no ideology, no political form, no economic form is eternal. Everything is constantly in a state of change. Great example of this. My favorite example of this. This is the best example of this I can think of. When I was in high school, in my little town, many people were deeply religious and they were very opposed to gay marriage. In order to ban gay marriage, there was a lot of people going around urging people to vote to ban gay marriage. And they had a bumper sticker. I saw this bumper sticker many times, and I had this conversation many times with people as a high school student. The bumper sticker said, marriage equals one man plus one woman, and then it would have a Bible verse. One man plus one woman equals marriage. And then it would have a Bible verse. And that was the argument about why gay marriage should be outlawed. Well, I would argue with people. I would say, have you ever read the Bible? Because Moses, his marriage was not one man plus one woman. Abraham had quite a few wives. Moses had quite a few wives. Throughout the Old Testament of the Bible, there are many, many great holy prophets, men of God, described in the Bible, who have way more than one wife. So if there is this eternal form of marriage, where marriage is one man plus one woman, why, thousands of years ago, was that clearly not the case? Well, the reality is that the family, like every other institution, is constantly evolving and changing. For the majority of human history, we were hunter-gatherers. Hunter-gatherer civilization was the first human civilization, where human beings were in tribes of 25, 30 people, hunting and gathering. And in those tribes, there were no families. They didn't even keep track of whose kid was whose kid. There was no institution of marriage, and there was no institution of property. They were hunting and gathering as a tribe. There was definitely hierarchy in the tribe. There was definitely discipline in the tribe. There was definitely rules and order. But there was definitely not an institution of marriage. There was definitely not an institution of private property. And there were no formal classes, right? There were certainly hierarchies, I'm sure. But that was the majority of human civilization. You don't get the institution of marriage, you don't get the family, until you have the origin of private property. And when the institution of marriage and the institution of the family emerges, originally, that institution is not one man plus one woman. It is one man and all of his property and all of his wife and all of his children. The institution of patriarchy was a man and his property was a family. Right? It's later that we get monogamy. There are parts of the world where they still have, polygamy, a man with many wives. Right? Now, we have gay marriage in most Western countries. Because there is no sacred, eternal way that the family should be. The family changed based on the economic base. The way the family started out, in the original economic form, there was no need for it. Hunter-gatherer civilization, there was no family structure. There was a tribe of people, and they were all one family. The way the family as an institution exists changes based on the economic form. Well, politics also changes based on the economic form. And the reason that no one thought of the idea of freedom of speech or freedom of assembly until about the 1400s in Europe is not because people were evil until then. That's wrong. The reason was that the stage of economic development had not yet gotten to the point to facilitate that level of freedom. Folks, in hunter-gatherer civilization, those people in hunter-gatherer civilization were working constantly in order to eat. They waged a daily battle for existence. They were not thinking about freedom of speech. They were not thinking about freedom of religion. They were just thinking about surviving. Right? The rise of subsistence farming, the rise of the domestication of animals, changes things, gives birth to new political forms. But, even feudalism. A feudal society is subsistence farming. You are growing enough food to eat. You are growing enough food to eat. Try running a society where you are just growing enough food to eat with freedom of assembly, with freedom of speech, with freedom of religion. Try running a feudal estate with that level of technology, that level of development, that level of barely getting by, right? Malnutrition-related deaths, short life expectancies. Try running a feudal estate on the basis of everyone can think whatever they want, do whatever they want, freedom of assembly. We're going to elect. It doesn't work. It wasn't until the rise of capitalism, until we got to a higher economic form called capitalism, that anybody ever talked about the right to freedom of speech, the right to freedom of assembly, the right to vote, the right to elected government. Nobody talked about any of those things. Why? Because we had not yet reached the level of economic development to facilitate those things. And, let me add, we do not have those things in the United States if we were to enter a crisis. Read the Constitution. If we go to war in the United States, if war is actually declared, if there is a congressional declaration of war, your freedom of speech goes away, and your freedom of assembly goes away. If there is a domestic insurrection in the country, if there's a civil war going on, your freedom of speech goes away. Your freedom of assembly goes away. If the circumstances cannot facilitate your rights go away. And this is what we need to understand, is that freedom in any society is based on a level of economic development. The reason that I'm allowed to get on YouTube here and say all the things that I say, criticizing the status quo in the United States, is because of the fact the United States is stable enough as a country that what I'm saying does not result in any consequences for society. There is no danger that people will rise up and overthrow the U.S. government because of what I'm saying on here. There's no danger of instability taking place in U.S. society because of what I say. This is what you need to understand. That freedom of speech in any society is based on a level of economic development and a level of stability in society. If a society does not have the level of economic development to facilitate freedom of speech, it doesn't have freedom of speech. If a society does not have a level of stability to facilitate freedom of speech, it doesn't have freedom of speech. And that you cannot separate political forms from economic forms. that rights do not exist in a vacuum. Rights do not exist in isolation from everything else. And we have to get beyond this notion of thinking about rights and freedoms as if they are eternal values. Right? It's just like that bumper sticker, 1 man plus 1 woman equals marriage. In the United States at this time, yes, not thousands of years ago, and not necessarily in the future. There's not an eternal form of marriage, and there is not an eternal form of the state and the government. The state did not exist in hunter-gatherer civilization, and the state, my hope is that eventually the state will wither away. But you cannot separate the economic form from the political form. Folks, is the USA a real democracy? A real democracy, meaning the rule of the people? Well, no. Any good American will tell you that we are a republic, not a democracy. We have a representative government. But it is democratic in the sense that we get to vote for our elected representatives. However, economics plays a pretty darn big role in how our representatives are selected and how it is determined who will be elected. Folks, Mike Pompeo is recently attacking the Islamic Republic of Iran on social media. Mike Pompeo, our lovely Secretary of State, warmongering psychopath, was on social media attacking the Islamic Republic of Iran. And he said, in his tirade against the Islamic Republic of Iran, he said that in Iran, hundreds of candidates are not allowed to run for office. And he said that proves that Iran is not a democratic country. Well, is it true that hundreds of candidates in Iran were barred from running for office? Yes. Before Iran has an election, they have a body called the Guardian Council. And this Guardian Council, made up of figures who were key in the Islamic Revolution, people that are in with the Shia Muslim ruling government, mullahs, ayatollahs, etc. They determine if someone is in line with the Islamic Republic and its constitution, and if they are approved to run for office, and if they are not approved to run for office. This Guardian Council, made up of people from the Islamic Revolution, determine who can run for office and who cannot. And it is official. It is in the Iranian constitution that the Guardian Council determines who is allowed to run for office and who is not. Once the Guardian Council approves somebody, they can run for office. The people get to vote for them. If the Guardian Council does not approve somebody, they do not get to run. All right? Now, that's not democratic, right? That is a restriction on democracy, right? It's not just anybody who wants to run for anything. The Guardian Council gets to decide who ultimately is allowed to run. That is a restriction on democracy. The thing is, we have that here in the United States. We have the exact same thing, except it's not codified into law. It's not codified into law, but we have the exact same thing. We have a vetting process in the United States. Before any election, the media, the politicians, the donor class, the intelligence agencies, they function as our de facto guardian council here in the United States. They determine who is treated fairly and who is treated as a legitimate candidate for office and who is not. They get together and they decide whose campaign will get funded, whose campaign will get positive media coverage, who will be treated as a serious candidate, and who will not. And they make it blatantly obvious in some instances. During the Democratic primary, Tulsi Gabbard and Kamala Harris were both polling between 0 and 1%. But look at the debates that happened on CNN. How much attention did Kamala Harris get? And how much attention did Tulsi Gabbard get? Our de facto guardian council decided for us that Kamala Harris was to be treated as a legitimate candidate and Tulsi Gabbard was not. Kamala Harris got lots of time on the debate stage and Tulsi Gabbard did not. Read about the meetings that were held in Long Island, New York, the fundraiser galas where they decided that Kamala Harris, she was our woman. Read about the meetings where they decided Joe Biden was our guy. Read some of the leaked emails that came out in 2016 to make sure that Bernie Sanders was not going to be treated as a legitimate candidate. Folks, we have a guardian council in the United States. It's made up of the people who control the means of production. Right? In the United States, our means of production, our banks, our factories, our centers of economic power, our railways, our oil production, oil wells, our airlines, our telecommunications, our computer companies. These things are owned by a group of people called capitalists. Right? They own major centers of economic power. They own them. And they operate these things that they own, banks, factories, big box stores, oil wells, telecommunications companies, tech giants, airlines. They operate them in order to make money for themselves. They own the means of production. And it is those who own the means of production that ultimately decide who is a legitimate candidate for office and who is not. They don't always agree with each other. There are big divisions among them. Some of them don't consider Donald Trump to be a legitimate candidate. Others do. Some of them don't consider Bernie Sanders to be a legitimate candidate. Others do. There are big disagreements among them. But among them, it is among those who control the means of production. It's among the ruling class of the United States, those who control the means of production. It is among them that the decision is made who is allowed to really be a candidate for office and who gets to have their name on the ballot and get ignored and get, just pretended, just ignored. They function as the guardian council of American capitalism. We have a guardian council, but it is not codified into law. It is a de facto guardian council. It is a rule of who has the most money. In the United States, the people who control the means of production are capitalists, owners of big banks, owners of big corporations, owners of tech giants, owners of big oil wells, owners of big banks, owners of Walmart, owners of Home Depot. They decide who's a legitimate candidate, and they are our guardian council. In Iran, the economy is controlled by the government and by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and by the mullahs and by the ayatollahs. And so, just like in the United States, the ayatollahs, the mullahs, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, they get together and they have the Guardian Council. And they decide who's allowed to run for office. It's the same thing. In Iran, the people who control the means of production decide who's allowed to be treated as a legitimate candidate and run for office. In the United States, the people who control the means of production decide who's allowed to be a legitimate candidate and who's allowed to run for office. The class that controls the means of production also ends up controlling the political forms. And that's true for any society. In China, the Communist Party functions similar to how the Guardian Council functions in Iran. The Communist Party decides who can run for office, who can be treated as a legitimate candidate. There are other parties in China. But the Communist Party, at the end of the day, the people who overthrew the government of Chiang Kai-shek, who established the People's Republic, the Communist Party decides who can run for office, who can be treated as a legitimate candidate is decided by the Communist Party. Why? Because the Communist Party controls the means of production. In China, there are a lot of private companies, a lot of private industries, but at the end of the day, The major banks, the major industries are all controlled by the Communist Party, and the government state central plan determines what goes on in production, so even private companies have to do what it says. So the Communist Party controls the means of production, and the Communist Party decides who can run for office. At the end of the day, the USA and China are about just as democratic. Right? There's certainly nowhere near the level of freedom of speech and freedom of assembly in China, right? I mean, in China, people don't have the same level of freedom of speech and freedom of assembly. That's true. But you have to remember, China's a much less stable society. There's a lot more poverty in China, right? There's a lot more terrorist groups and people trying to overthrow them, and a lot more instability. But at the end of the day, in the United States, the people who control the means of production determine who gets to run for office. In China, the people who control the means of production determine who gets to run for office, right? It's not as hard to understand as you might think, but we're entering that dangerous area. We're entering this area where people get blocked, right? Because we're deconstructing this logic that says there are good countries and bad countries, there are countries with freedom, there are countries that are dictatorships. No, every country is a dictatorship. As long as one group of people controls the means of production. As long as the means of production are controlled by one group of people, that group of people that controls the means of production is going to control the politics. On capitalism, they control it in a default manner. When countries break free from capitalism, they codify their control. But at the end of the day, those who control the means of production control society. In China, it is a proletarian party, a party with 90 million members, based among the population at large. They've got members in every apartment building, they've got members in every little hut in every little village. The Chinese Communist Party, with its 90 million members, controls the means of production, and it controls the Chinese state. And yes, people vote, there are elections and such, but the Communist Party decides who gets to run, make sure that people that run for office are in line with what the Communist Party wants, because the Communist Party controls the means of production. In the United States, the capitalists control the means of production, and the capitalists decide who gets to run for office. They make sure that the people who get elected in the government are in line with their vision of what it means to run society. The people who... This is how these things work. And in terms of freedom, freedom to protest, freedom to dissent, in societies that are very, very, very stable, you can protest, you can dissent. In societies that are not very stable, you can't. If there was a civil war in the United States right now, I wouldn't be able to speak to you the way I'm speaking right now. But there's not. Right? It's a hard pill for a lot of people to swallow. It's a very, very hard pill for a lot of people to swallow. But this narrative that there are good countries and bad countries have freedom, bad countries don't, this is wrong. It's not understanding the nature of reality. If the United States were at a lower level of economic development, there would be a lower level of freedom. If the United States were at a lower level of stability, there would be a lower level of freedom. Just so happens that because of global imperialism, because the United States is at the center of the global economy, there is a high level of stability here, and there is a high level of economic development here. So as a result, there is a high level of freedom, and that's a good thing. That is a good thing. But if that were not the case, if there were a lower level of economic development here, there were a lower level of stability here, there would be a lower level of freedom. I'm repeating myself because these are very, very difficult things for a lot of people to understand. These are not simple concepts. This is not something people naturally come to understand in U.S. society. Everything is set up to keep you from understanding this. You are not supposed to understand this. But this is how these things work. And the goal of socialism is to raise the level of development and stability across the entire world so high, not only so high that everyone has the same level of freedom that we have here in the United States, but so high that we have even more freedom than we have in the United States right now. The goal of socialism and communism is to raise the level of abundance, raise the level of stability in society so high that the need for a government, the need for a state, withers away. That is the goal. But that cannot happen when the means of production, the major centers of economic power, the banks, factories, and industries, are operated simply to make a profit for those who own them. In order to establish the level of economic development that can facilitate more freedom than any of us can ever imagine, you must have a centrally planned economy. The means of production must operate rationally. Last live, I talked to you all about the fact that under capitalism, people are homeless because there are too many houses. Under capitalism, people are hungry because there is too much food. That capitalism is a highly irrational system. Capitalism is a system that creates poverty amid abundance. Capitalism is a system that, as technology advances, the result is greater poverty because people lose their jobs and are replaced by machines. Capitalism is a system where, a lot of times stores, will dump their food out at the end of the night and pour motor oil on it because they don't want some homeless person to eat it out of the garbage. Why? Because they didn't produce that food so people could eat it. They produced that food so it could be sold. Production for profit, not production for social use. This is capitalism, right? I've used the example many times of how in Union Square, Burlington Coat Factory was throwing out a bunch of old coats they couldn't sell. But before they threw them away, they took a knife and cut them up. Why? They didn't want a homeless person to take them out of the garbage, because if that happened, a homeless person might not buy a coat from them. Production, they didn't, for profit, not for use. They didn't make those coats so people could wear them. They made those coats so they could make a profit from them. Capitalism is a highly unrational, non-rational, irrational system. Capitalism is a system of production for profit. Under capitalism, you can have all kinds of homeless people, all kinds of empty houses. Under capitalism, you can have people starving because too much food is being produced. The point of socialism is to create a situation where abundance does not lead to poverty. The point of socialism is to cease production for profit, is to have the means of production controlled by society. It's so we the people and our revolutionary organizations take control of the means of production. And with our control of the means of production, we get rid of this contradiction. No more do we have people homeless because there's too many houses. No more do we have people hungry because there's too much food. Because the means of production are centrally planned by society. This is how Karl Marx explained it, and this is how I'll end my opening remarks. In a higher phase of communist society, after the enslaving subordination of the individual to the division of labor, and therewith also the antithesis between mental and physical labor has vanished. After labor has become not only a means of life, but life's prime want. After the productive forces have also increased with all-around development of the individual, and all the springs of cooperative wealth flow more abundantly, only then can the narrow horizon of bourgeois right be crossed in its entirety, and society inscribe on its banners, from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. Let's break that down. In a higher phase of communist society, meaning not socialism, not the first stage, right? Not just after the workers have taken power, not what China is right now, not what Cuba is right now. In the higher stage, the ultimate stage. In a higher phase of communist society, after the enslaving subordination of the individual to the division of labor, and therewith the antithesis between mental and physical labor has vanished, meaning that there's no longer even a division between those who work with their hands and those who work with their minds, right? That the division between physical labor and mental labor is broken down. We no longer have some people who work with their brains and some people who work with their bodies. After labor has become not only a means of life, but life's prime want, meaning that people no longer are going to work simply because they have to pay their bills. But when we have reached a state where people find work fulfilling, because technology has advanced so much and work in and of itself is rewarding, after the labor has become not only a means of life, but life's prime want, meaning that people live to work. They go to work to create, to use their minds, to be creative. They find work to be fulfilling. Work is no longer alienated when work is rewarding. After the productive forces have increased with the all-around development of the individual, meaning that everyone's work is an expression of their individuality, and all the springs of cooperative wealth flow more abundantly because the means of production is rationally controlled cooperatively, and because technology has advanced, so much abundance is being created. The springs of cooperative wealth are flowing more abundantly. Only then can the narrow horizon of bourgeois right be crossed in its entirety, and society inscribe on its banners, from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. So only after rationally controlling the means of production, raising the level of productivity so high, raising the level of abundance so high, getting to the point where there's no division between mental and physical labor, getting to the point where people only work because they enjoy it, right? That work is no longer a degrading, alienated experience, but we get to the point that work is a fulfilling experience. It's life's prime want. Only when, as he says, the productive forces have increased the all-around development of the individual, and the springs of cooperative wealth flow more abundantly. Only then can the narrow horizon of bourgeois right be crossed in its entirety, and society ascribe on its banners, from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. That is the goal. The goal is to reach a level of material abundance in which everyone has total freedom. Not just freedom of speech, not just freedom of assembly, but freedom to do whatever they want. People work because they feel like working, because it gives them fulfillment. There's no need for a government. There's no need for a prison. People do what they want to do. People take what they need, right? That is the ultimate goal. The goal of communism is total freedom, a level of freedom beyond anything any of us can imagine. That is the goal of communism. But just like the freedom we have now, just like the freedoms that have existed before, freedom is rooted in economics. You cannot separate political forms from economic forms. Freedom is not eternal, just like the family is not eternal. Nothing in the universe is eternal. Everything is in a state of constant flux. And the goal is to build a society with so much freedom and so much abundance and so much prosperity that all of us can live a life beyond anything we can imagine, full of prosperity, abundance, liberty, and happiness. That is how Marxists and socialists understand the concepts of human rights, of liberty, democracy, equality, etc. And this is the conversation that you need to have. This is what you need to understand if you want to engage in our world, where the illusion and the values of liberals are being passed off as the truth. And on that note, that concludes my opening remarks.